Yeah, so I'm just feeling like what was spoken was already so rich.
Does that mean you don't want us to pack more in?
You're ready to go now?
I'm ready to go. I have got a lot to work on. It's great. The fidelity to false refuge, even just identifying like what is my relationship to refuge, and coming back to that again and again, and like looking at motivation. Yeah, I mean, I'm also doing the mind training group.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, this just fits so well with looking at what I'm doing. Period. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I don't know if this isn't really a question, but just something I've struggled with when you were talking about like using meditation and kind of like the path for like self-help versus like how it can be used in like a positive self-help way, in a way where you're like actually just a kinder, more compassionate person. So I just define that kind of difference, like that subtle difference, hard to navigate. Because I want to just like think about it in a really black and white way, so I just have trouble, I don't know, thinking about that balance.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say anything.
Do you have something?
Michael often talked about, especially when we first started coming, about undermining the commitment to the self. That was kind of it seemed like kind of an acid test for him. You could tell if your practice was sort of going in the right direction, if you were trying to support the self or undermine the self, the commitment to the self. And
that's right. He would talk about we spend all our lives defining and defending personal territory, and we count as friends the people who support that territory, and we count as enemies the people who challenge that sense of territory.
Meanwhile, it's just the opposite.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it can be exactly the opposite. The people who remind us where our territory is
Our
can be
true friends, yeah.
it can really be benefiting us.
So that can be some little guy.
But it is gray. I mean, a lot of our relationship to the path is gray. It's not wholly positive or wholly negative, wholly skillful or wholly unskillful, wholly confused, wholly clear. And that's a piece of what we wrestle with in getting honest with ourselves about what's actually going on. And then, if you have any sense of commentary or judgment around that, that's the perfect moment to practice a little loving kindness. And just offer yourself, embrace the totality of your experience, and to offer a sense of ease and comfort and love, without conditions. Yeah, right.
I just felt like I agree with your sentiment. It was just really rich earlier, and there's two or three things that were like the key topics of what you were talking about, and I was just wondering if you could articulate those in just a couple of sentences. I know the cornerstone you said of having a refuge was one of them, and just for something for my mind to kind of loop back around, if I could have like a phrase like that for the other. I know there's at least one other key topic that you touched on.
We talked about looking at what your actual motivations are,
Mhm.
positive and negative, like
Mhm.
becoming familiar with what your mind is doing. What else?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
not reducing the path to samsara management,
Mhm.
and discovering and deepening our sense of refuge.
Yeah, thank you.
Letting that be the big context. Are we good to move?
I have one question.
Yeah.
So what if your motivations aren't pure? How do
You're the one.
how do you work with that?
uh, well, I think unless you're a Buddha manifesting in samsara, then at least some of your motivation is not going to be perfectly pure. And I think really our job over time is we're trying to plant the seeds that shift the balance more and more in the direction of us being driven by loving kindness, compassion, a sense of joy, a sense of equanimity. So anything that we can do with energy and intention on the side of holding a big view, really trying to nurture a sense of connection to sentient beings, making aspirations, even just recognizing and articulating, I don't feel a sense of refuge, I have a longing, I wish that I had it. Like just the longing to really feel a sense of refuge, a sense of being at home in your practice, I think it's planting a seed. It's putting making that wish. May I have this someday? Like putting energy behind that it bears fruit over time. It does, little by little. It just sort of tips the balance. That would be my advice. Or I should say, that is my experience. It's not really advice.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think one reason we wanted to do this class was to demystify things, and that's a perfect question to demystify. No, very few people have even mostly pure motivation to practice the Dharma, and it's okay. Like that's where we are.
That's right. We're all a member of that club. So welcome.
It's not always obvious that it's okay to acknowledge that, but it's okay to acknowledge that, and then do all the steps Sally said.
It seems like it's really important and really interesting, honestly, to sort of reflect upon this, like the purpose of our intentions, what our intentions are, and the purpose, especially like you mentioned, Sally, with this. It just seems like there's this current pop culture, magazine cover, Facebook Buddhism that is about. Apparently, it's about living mindfulness, which I think means getting the most out of living in the moment, which is cool, and relaxing. There's a lot of you relax, you meditate to relax and be peaceful, and then you live in the moment. You try not to be too money obsessed or materialistically obsessed, and I find myself running into people that will say that, oh yeah, Buddhism's cool, it's about relaxing, living in the moment. And I think, well, kinda sometimes. And I think that's actually, those were not the reasons whatsoever that I pursued Buddhism at all, actually. And sometimes it's relaxing, sometimes it's not relaxing. But it is definitely like something I find myself wrangling with a lot now, because sometimes I just don't know what to do with it. Like people will kind of pop that out there in all different forms, either in personal conversation or as a reflection upon what they think they're doing as mindfulness practice, which is actually, I think, just some kind of relaxation exercise, and then kind of like, reading articles and things like referring to what I think a lot of people currently think is sort of this weird neo-Californian Buddhism thing, that isn't really, I just never know. I don't want to like let the air out of their balloon and say, actually, that's, I don't know that that's right, what you're thinking, or even what you're like thinking it's about, or what it's for, but it's definitely on, it's on the covers of those magazines at the checkout and pops up on social media, and it's it's often I just leave it alone because I think that's not my intention. None of that, very little of that is my intention to practice, and much more of my intention is kind of like what you said early on for you, was just to sort of feel better, like maybe kind of get some kind of perspective on mortality, and maybe feel a little less suffering sometimes.
Yeah, when somebody floats something like that by me, that there's always this sort of mischievous impulse. I half want to say, actually, Buddhist practice to remove all suffering from the world and to release every sentient being from this realm, this confused realm of samsara. You can't really do that. But yeah, there's a different thing we're trying to do. We're not just training our minds so that we can be more savvy in life. We are honing our minds like a scalpel so that we can cut through confusion and experience the true nature of things and be of benefit to all sentient beings. That's the idea, whether we believe we're capable of it or not. The context is very big.
And also, the notion of kind of, being mindfully aware of pain, essentially, without necessarily grasping a hold of it, but not trying to, whatever, magically make it go away or bury it or stuff it or deny it or, that seems, super important, and not like something I necessarily want to bring up to somebody that doesn't, that just sort of thinks it's sort of the latest cure to, pain and suffering. It'll be interesting to see where this goes, I guess, in our kind of pop culture right now with all the mindfulness and kind of meditating to do better at the office and have it somehow be a part of yoga and sort of like the latest sort of new age manifestation in a way, it seems like.
Well, I'm looking at the clock, we should probably
That's true.
pack more in.
That's right. Time management has not been our best thing in this class. We did our first class last year. We constrained our content, and we were pretty good on time. So, all right, we're going to power through. Your comments, Joe, actually are a perfect transition to talking about immeasurable compassion, which is the second of the 4 immeasurables, and we wanted in each of these classes to try to touch into this idea of holding a bigger view and recognizing that our daily practice takes place potentially in this really expansive context of trying to relate to all sentient beings and to be of benefit to ourselves and others. So last week we just touched really briefly on the practice of loving kindness. And for years, like I got a few teachings on the four immeasurables, I could never figure out what's the difference between loving kindness and compassion. They were always sort of one big squishy mess for me. And it was really only in prepping this and spending some time with Alan Wallace's book that I started to see the practice of immeasurable loving kindness is meant to be just a 100% positive side of the coin. No, like looking at people, when we're wishing happiness, we're not looking around to understand the reasons people are unhappy. We're not focusing on their suffering. It's really just this sense of letting loving kindness overflow, and overflow for yourself and for others, whether they seem like they need it or not. So it's really about just getting in touch with that completely positive experience. And the practice of compassion is sort of the flip side of the coin. The practice of compassion is about looking around and recognizing that we suffer, that other people suffer, and really wishing that suffering would be solved, that it would be removed in both its mundane manifestations, like the things that we can see in front of us that people are experiencing that are challenging and negative and unpleasant in their lives, and also if we can hold it, that the bigger sense of suffering, like the Buddha's diagnosis of our illness is that fundamentally we suffer because we're confused about our own nature, because we don't see who we actually are, and we don't experience the fact that we are intimately connected with all beings, whether we have met them or not, that there's really a bond there. So Jeff's going to explain kind of how to formally work with the practice of compassion, but it is really about coming in, being willing to bring your awareness to suffering, and then nurturing the wish that might be removed. One of the things that Alan Wallace introduces in his book, The Four Immeasurables, Practices to Open the Heart,
Which you can buy there.
is this idea of the near enemy and the far enemy of each of these practices. So he says, in the case of compassion, the near enemy of compassion is grief.
So the far enemy is kind of the opposite, and the near enemy is the thing that can be mistaken for it.
That's right, the thing that's sort of close to it but not quite right. So with loving kindness, he says the near enemy is desire, that when we're generating these positive wishes, we can move just a little sideways into this place of kind of, I wish I had all of that. I'm generating all of these things, and I want them. And I want them for me, and maybe I want them for the people who are close to me. And the far enemy, the sort of opposite with loving kindness is hatred or enmity. This idea that we look out at the world and we pick and choose. We think, may these beings have happiness, but you really deserve to suffer. You don't deserve happiness. So it's moving into that space of actually unintentionally sort of nurturing our sense of us and them, who deserves happiness and who doesn't deserve happiness. So in the case of compassion, the near enemy is grief. So when we do any practice where we're working with an awareness of suffering, possible to relate to that in a way that we become overwhelmed, where we start looking at all of the things that are wrong in the world, and it starts to make us feel sad and full of grief, and it can lead to a sense of despair, like the suffering's never going to end. Suffering can't end. I've got nothing to offer in the face of suffering that is that large. And Alan is really advising that when we work with a practice like compassion, we have to work at a level where we can come into touch with the suffering and feel an upwelling of compassion without overwhelming ourselves to the point where we can't do anything positive with it. And then the far enemy, which I think is a little less relevant for, well, no, I won't say that. The far enemy, when you're talking about compassion, is cruelty. To see the suffering, to see someone suffering and rejoice in that suffering, to wish that they would have that suffering. And I was about to say, well, we don't really have that. That's not really relevant for our practice. But when I think about my own reaction to current politics, actually, I have that quite a bit. The strong conviction that there are some people out there who are causing a lot of suffering, and they deserve to suffer.
Right.
Okay,
We're running out of
sorry.
time.
Yeah, I know. You just have to start poking me.
Yeah, sorry. Because we didn't get to do this last time, and I really want to get to do this time, and we're running out of time, and probably shouldn't race through it, but there you are. So the four measurables are one of the nice practices that you can do on the cushion and also carry them out into the world. Not every practice is so good for that. The extent to which you do it on the cushion supports going out into the world, and it really helps you can practice it on the cushion so that it's available for you when you're in the world. And there's a formal practice that goes with the four measurables, which I will mention here. They mostly look the same, and as I go through these, I'm gonna mostly talk about them in the context of compassion, which we're talking about today. But I'm gonna mention some of the differences that apply to loving kindness, which we touched on last week. When you do this practice, you begin by and actually, this is the one. Sorry. This one is actually better for loving kindness. The compassion is slightly different. You start out with a slightly different one. Most of the time you start out thinking of your own self. And so thinking about loving kindness. I read a quote from Alan Wallace last week that said, where he talked about how the seed of the wish for happiness that we all have, like everybody wants to be happiness, is the root of that is our Buddha nature. And so when we're thinking about loving kindness, we're wishing that everybody has happiness. And the kind of happiness, the flavor of that happiness, is this happiness that goes down to that taproot of loving kindness. Not like, you gotta somebody said something nice to you, or other flavors of happiness. It's like that deep, abiding, stable kind of happiness. So when you begin the practice, you're going to go through and practice on thinking about different people. You're going to start with yourself, go to somebody you love, go to somebody you're neutral, and then go to somebody whom you have enmity or a troublesome relationship. And I'm going to walk through those, but I thought I'd give you the oversight so you can see how this unfolds. When you practice for yourself, imagine, so when you're doing when you're starting out and you're doing the loving kindness, you just relax into the idea that in that moment you do have happiness. That happiness is just available and everything else can just fall away. This is one of those moments when you might see all the expectations of your practice rise up. And a big part of this practice and doing it formally is to watch what arises. So as you're doing this, if you're thinking, I don't really deserve this kind of happiness, watch that thing arise, because that's a big part of this practice. You want to be able to encourage, you want to be able to feel that connection to that taproot Buddha nature, but you also want to be able to see the barriers to that. So in the contemplation, you begin with yourself, and there's no instruction about doing this for 1 minute or 10 minutes or an hour. You can do it however long you want. The idea really is just to work with that experience. Then you go to someone you love, have a strong positive connection to, and both with compassion and loving kindness, with compassion, you're going to think of the person's, the kind of suffering that they have and wish that it was gone. If you're working on loving kindness, you're going to think about, like Sally said, their joys and wishes, and wish that those would increase, and wish that their troubles went away. Wish them that all that good stuff. With compassion, you're going to wish away the bad stuff. And again, you're going to want to watch what arises. Like maybe you think you have a great relationship with that person, but something arises. Like maybe it's not pure unmitigated wish, like you see something you didn't see. Or maybe it is a pure wish, and in that moment you realize, I really feel this. Whatever it is, part of the meditation is to be aware of those things. The reason we do it through this progression is because it's a lot easier to imagine wishing the suffering away from somebody we love. We want to get good at that, because once we have that experience with someone we love, we can gingerly try it out on someone we don't necessarily have a super close relationship. We can try pushing it outward a little bit. And so then we move on to somebody with whom we have a neutral relationship. And it's usually described as somebody you don't really know that well. There's not a lot of description on this, and for me, this is always the most challenging one. And I think in some ways it's designed to be challenging, because most beings we don't feel a connection to. So you then move to a person who's neutral, and you try to wish away the suffering, or wish for good things wish for that person to be happy. And what you don't want to do here is create a kind of sentimental, artificial sense of those things. If you don't actually feel the wish, that you don't actually feel compassion for somebody you don't know, manufacturing it is not the instruction in the practice. We're trying to build on our actual wish for people. So you can have the wish for the wish, but just note, like, I don't actually feel that, and just see. And if you do this practice over the course of a month or a year or 10 years or 50 years, you'll see changes. So always watch. Try to do the practice and watch what's happening when you're doing the practice. The final person is somebody with which you have a tough relationship. And you want to choose somebody that will help you in this practice. Remember that we're trying to cultivate the sense of loving kindness and compassion. So we don't want to have somebody that we have such a conflicted relationship with that it kind of blots out the practice and makes us have a conflicted relationship with the practice. Choose somebody who's kind of appropriate, your boss, or somebody who is not going to send you into a cycle of rage. When you're working with the enemy, it's always called the enemy. That's weird. I don't relate to that word, but the instructions often use that word enemy. It's actually effective when you're thinking about loving kindness to think about somebody who's successful that you have a negative relationship with, because the instruction is to wish them well and wish that they have happiness. And one of the ways that we, when we're thinking about other people that we have a conflicted relationship with, is we wish they didn't have happiness. We're not in a position. We're not usually trying to encourage ourselves to wish that they had even more happiness. We have kind of a small view there. And if it's somebody who is, if we're around compassion, thinking about somebody who is suffering, because like Sally said, we don't often think about ourselves wishing people cruelty, but you'd be surprised if you have a conflicted relationship and you think about somebody suffering, how seductive it is to go to the place of, you really deserve that. You know, you really deserve that. And then, so work with that and try to find a place where you can actually see the possibility of wishing that suffering wasn't there. And again, a big part of the practice is watching what happens. That's part of the learning that goes along with these things. When you are off the cushion, so if you practice this really well and can remember throughout the day, then you will find beings of all these categories throughout your day, and you can work with those people in your own mind stream. When we're doing practice, the compassion practice or the loving kindness practice, the four immeasurables, the main beneficiary is ourselves. We're not actually trying to transfer compassion to somebody else. We're trying to remember that our connection to this person comes through this filter of all these different things. And we're actually trying to create the possibility in our mind stream that when we encounter other people, these feelings arise in our own mind stream, which is itself a kind of clarity that will be beneficial. But you're not actually trying to relieve suffering when you meet people. That's sometimes a thing you can stub your toe on, especially if you're hoping somebody's really suffering, you're really thinking that your practice may alleviate their suffering. That can be kind of a challenge. The one difference between these two practices is in compassion, you can start out with yourself, particularly if you're suffering. It's perfectly fine to start out with yourself. It's also good if you happen to know of somebody who is suffering, somebody who's in the hospital, somebody who's just died, somebody who's going through mental trauma. This is a really good practice to work with them. Instead of using yourself, you can put them there, because if you have any kind of positive relationship with them, when you see somebody really suffering, or it doesn't even have to be a human, it can be an animal, it's a really good place to start in encouraging that kind of genuine, authentic sense of wishing for that suffering to go away. So you can work with somebody who's suffering in the compassion practice. So that's the formal practice, and then the caring part is just it's half mindfulness and it's half application.
And the one caution that I've heard again and again in relationship with working with the immeasurables, and Alan Wallace also mentions it in his book, is don't push too far too fast. Like if you've never worked with this before and you're just starting to do it and you're feeling some resistance around it, there is no obligation to immediately go from self to positive to neutral to negative. Like, we need to work with what we can work with, and kind of not move forward until we're really genuinely generating something that feels positive, that actually feels like the wish that somebody would be happy, the wish that they would be relieved of their suffering. And it's, it can feel foreign, not exactly relatable may not be precisely the way that we're used to thinking. So if you're really struggling with feeling it for yourself, like stay there for a bit. If you can't, if you're struggling trying to find it even for somebody who you feel close to, just stay there. Like you don't have to immediately go to the most difficult place. It can be sort of a progression. And when you get to the point of working with somebody who who you have a difficult relationship with, don't immediately go to the hardest one. Like, go to the guy who annoys you by sometimes eating half your sandwich out of the fridge at work, or like it's okay to start with something that feels approachable. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when I think about wishing happiness on people that I have a tough time with, I guess I don't struggle with that as much, because when I think of them being happy, I think of them being enlightened and happy, which means having overcome those qualities or characteristics of them that I think are rude or closed-minded. So I think, wow, I can actually really easily imagine this person happy as being overcome of these things. So it's like, I mean, I think there's a lot of good in it, but it's probably self-cushioning. But I don't think wishing them some stark happiness, like total popularity and like success of every sort, like that doesn't help. I don't even think that's what we're really supposed to do, right? We're supposed to wish them like wisdom and compassion. That's how I do that.
Yeah.
Part of the practice is to watch your mind, and so try both. If you wish somebody you have a conflicted relationship with just regular happiness, that they are really popular, see what happens.
Well, yeah, they can be popular. It depends how they're experiencing it. If they're going to be really happy about it, or anyway.
Yeah, and there's a little interesting potential pitfall there. It's, do I wish them happiness, or do I wish that they would be the way that I would like them to be? Which would make me happy.
Right.
And which I think would make them happy. Yeah, it's really, I think there's no right answer there. It's really about engaging, trying to generate those wishes and then seeing what happens. So we're right at 9. So your homework for the week is, along with manifesting your intention to practice, is to, if you can, to just explore a little bit your own sense, your experience of what your motivation is around your practice, and why you practice if you do practice, and why you're not practicing if you don't practice. If your experience this week is resistance, like, let's just take a look. What's going on there? And think of it. I think of it. I took chemistry in high school, and they would make you do those experiments, and it didn't actually matter whether you got the right answer or not, as long as you wrote up what happened thoroughly, you could still get an A in the class. This is a little like that. Like, it's not about the right answer. It's like, you just observe what actually happens and bring your attention to that, and something will be learned in there. So just see what you can find. And then in the category of remembering, I wanted to offer one little trick that Jeff came up with that I found really handy, and that other people might find handy as a reminder to carry practice throughout the day. Do you want to explain how you came to the Post-it?
I don't know how I came to it. I just know that I did it.
a divine inspiration occurred, and one day Jeff had read, the way I heard the story was...
I'm sure that's accurate. Old brain, I don't know what I did.
as part of his practice, he had been looking at a Dharma book, and a phrase really jumped out at him, and it occurred to him to write it down. And he wrote it down on a little Post-it note, and then he took a photo of it, and he made it the background of the lock screen on his phone. So every time he picked up his phone, it would pop up, and that little message would be there. And so then I started doing it, and I found it really handy. I also found that it seemed to work for about 4 or 5 days, and then I became so inured to it that like I just filtered it out. But I pick up my phone constantly throughout the day. I no longer wear a watch. I use it as a clock, and so every time I check the time, I'd see your commitment is 10 minutes, or
You have to take my cat off there?
what's that?
Take my cat
No,
off.
you have to get your cat to hold the car.
There's a Photoshop project. So we just offer that as a sort of tips and tricks if you're feeling like you need help remembering to touch base, to kind of touch in with your practice as you go throughout your day. And that it's a fun one. Can be a fun one to try. So let's go ahead and dedicate the merits.
Again, if you don't have this memorized, just imagine that the benefit of what we've done here today goes out and touches all beings.
Without exception.
Without exception.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Thank you, everyone. And I just remembered in the category of holding a big
Maybe we should do that
view.
next time.
You want to do it next
Let's
time?
do it next time.
Okay.
It's too big.
Coming attraction.
You can't not say something.